All right, here we go. So we are looking at if I'm not mistaken, it's the third story in section 2 of Dubliners. So we got in section 1 is the first 3 stories, an encounter, the sisters Araby, and now we've read, Evelyn, After the Race, and now Two Gallants. So section 2 is adolescence, right? And it's on page 49 of your handbook here. So right away, as you pointed out, the title is just nonsensical, right? These boys are the opposite of gallantry. They take advantage of women. They are in no way, shape, or form examples of gallant men. The story basically follows these 2 boys, Corley and Linehan. The story all takes place in one day. And we've got this sort of type of narration that's third person. And it brings us in and out, much in the same way that After the Race did. James Joyce purposefully keeps us at a distance so that we are not always made aware of details of things for example, in their conversation, much in the way it was in After the Race, where like when they were on the boat, we're kind of looking outside the window. We can tell somebody's telling a joke because somebody said something and everybody's laughing, but we don't know what the joke was. It's like we're not meant to have heard it. We're kept at a distance. We're meant to be outsiders. He doesn't draw us in and make us feel really close to the character in the way that he did in some of the other stories, like Araby, for example. So basically, we're following these 2 young men. It's a Sunday. We know that later on in the story because of the way the maid is dressed. It's a Sunday, presumably summer, maybe July, August. Corey and Linehan are walking through Dublin, and Corey is telling Linehan a story, and we don't know what the story is, but Linehan laughs, and he appreciates Corley's tale. And Linehan is kind of the narrator of the story, but it's in and out. Linehan sort of tells us a story, but then it's third person. Joyce is in and out with this. And we know that Linehan is a social leech. He's described as integrating himself into people's social situations, like, showing up at a bar and hanging out on the outskirts of a group of people until he gets bought a round of drinks, that kind of thing. And when Linehan asked Corley where he met this woman that Corley says he's about to go see later, Corley proceeds to talk about her as if she's like his lover, and she's a maid. Now, it's important to note that Irish women at that time, and we talked about this a little bit in Evelyn, and the way that they were treated by especially Irish men represents the decline of Ireland under English rule. We talked a little bit about that in Evelyn. I don't know if we need to go into a lot of detail about it now, but neither Corley nor Linehan nor any other man mentioned in the story is gallant in any way towards women. Let's just leave it at that for now, right? And he's talking about his lover, who is his maid, right? And the maid plays a small but significant, I should say. Corley first met her one evening, and this led to the 2 of them taking a walk around the canal, during which she told Corley that she works as a domestic maid, or they refer to it as a slavery, in a house on Bagot Street, which it's implied that Corley and the maid have sex after this initial meeting because he says something about he was worried she might get in the family way. That's just another way of, worried that she might get pregnant. But he reckons that she's on top of it, right? So it's leaving the onus on the woman. You know what I mean? It's like he's not worried about using protection or anything. He's just leaving it all on her, and he's doesn't seem to be prepared to, do anything to take care of a child if and when as she came along. She seems to have some genuine feelings for him, but he doesn't really care for her. He just wants her to buy him stuff, right? He's using her. What does he get out of her? Like some free cigarettes and some high quality cigars. He buys her train tickets. And of course, at the end of the story, he's manipulated her into stealing from her employer, right? And he brags about that, and this is the premise of the whole story. We don't know, are you going to convince her to do it? These types of things, that we can look at some of the things that he bought. Cigarettes every night on page 51. She brought cigarettes every night she'd bring me and paying the tram out and back. One night she brought me 2 bloody fine cigars, real cheese. And then I was afraid, man, she'd get in the family way. Right? He was worried she'd get pregnant. So he's talking, she's buying him all these things and then they're having sex, right? He was like, I'm kind of worried she might get pregnant. And she thinks he's high class, right? Woman's not too bright, She's the one, bringing him all this stuff. He's apparently not bringing her anything, right? So he thinks she's too savvy maybe to get pregnant and he just leaves it at that, right, with her. Still walking through the city, Linehan asks Curly if he can pull it off. Now, what is it, right? We find out later in the story that it means she's going to be stealing this gold coin from him, right? Now, I thought when I was reading it, it kind of meant, is he going to maybe sleep with her, right? And I thought maybe when he was talking about he was worried that she'd get pregnant, that was sort of just boasting, that he hadn't really slept with her yet. You know what I mean? But it turns out, that was wrong. And that might have been intentional on Joyce's part to sort of lead us down to sort of have a twist in the plot at the end, if you will, Now they go on, and Corley is the son of a police officer, but he seems to be uninterested in work, and there's some hints that he might make money as a police informant. It talks about how he walks around he's seen with policemen in plain clothes, talking earnestly. He knew the inner side of all the affairs, and he was fond of delivering final judgments. So he was he was aware of the word on the street, and I guess through maybe some of his father's friends, he'd make judgments on people and he'd fill in the police about it, and he probably got a little bit of spare change, a little bit of money for doing that. But he didn't have any real job, right? So womanizing sort of became his job. And he assures Linehan that this will work out, and it's in the crudest of terms that he mentions it. And the two proceed to talk about women that Corley has dated in the past. And it goes on page 52. I don't know if you picked up on this, but it says when he's describing him and his working with the police briefly there, it's kind of alluding to that. It doesn't come right out and say it. It shows that he's a narcissist. His conversation is always about himself and what kind of person he was. And so it shows us that he is a narcissist. And when he's reporting these dialogues, it says he aspirated the first letter of his name. So to aspirate, instead of Corley, he's pronouncing his name with an aspiration. So it's not a hard sound. It's he turns it into a vowel. So I imagine it sounded something like Horley, right? Which, he's a womanizer, calling himself Horley. It's almost intentional, I think, that he does that, right? So he's a whoremonger. He's whoring out these women, he's making them pay him, right, to sleep with them. So he, in fact, is the whore here, right? So at some point in their walking, they come across this harp in the road, right? Let's see, on page 54, right? Not far from the porch, the club, a harpist stood in the doorway, playing a little ring of listeners, and he plucked the wires heedlessly, so, not very emotionally. And it says the harp, too, was heedless, and then it personifies the harp as being a woman, that her coverings had fallen about her knees. So the harp is a symbol of Ireland, right? It's the national symbol of Ireland. It represents the state of Ireland under English colonial rule. And the harp that appears in Two Gallants is being played by this street performer who, quote unquote, plays heedlessly, kind of connects the harp to this Irish tradition of a failing economy. The weariness of not only the musician playing the harp, but also the harp itself is portrayed as being weary and heedless, just helps further emphasize the decline that Ireland is in right now. It also, I think, symbolizes the way that Ireland itself has been historically controlled, exploited, mistreated by the British, who we have to remember is Ireland's colonial masters, right? And then there's two quotes that are important about this harp if you want to expand upon that. One is the one I just pointed out, still walking, Linehan and Corley see the harp is playing heedlessly, blah, blah, blah. And then later, after Corley leaves him, and he's having a little epiphany moment where it says his face looks older, his gaiety seems to forsake him, and he thinks back to the harp player that he saw earlier, right? There's two instances where the harp sort of show the power of their symbolism, its symbolism there. And the fact that, it's almost the way that the harp is being personified here with her coverings down about her knees, it almost is a metaphor for like a woman being raped, if you will, or at least taken advantage of, or at least being vulnerable. Like, there's that phrase like, oh, you got caught with your pants down. That means you're in a vulnerable state. But when that applies to like a woman, fallen about her knees, like the implication is that she's being taken advantage of, or she's ripe for the being taken advantage of. And that sort of is symbolic of Ireland. So Ireland is the one, bent over with its pants pulled down, waiting for England to rape it, right? It's been already repeatedly raped, So that's a bit of a graphic metaphor, but that's in fact I think what Joyce meant, by that. So apologies for the crude metaphor, but I think that's really what Joyce was getting at there. And they go into talk about. Let's see. They walk up the street without speaking. The mournful music follows them. There she is. They see her, right? He mentions the girl. He doesn't want to introduce her. He allows the friend to sort of walk past him, is what they agree on, right? Corley he says he used to be a proper romantic at some point, right? He talks about how he used to date other women, and this just, he used to buy women things and take them out, and it just wasn't worth it, right? He said, like, that's a fool's game. It's a sap. It's later in the story he refers to that. But it's important to point that out, I think. And so one woman in the past that Corley had been with now is apparently a prostitute. They mention, he reveals this, that she was in a car with, some other men, and they sort of joke with each other, like, you're the one that turned her into that, you know what I mean? And he was like, I wasn't her first, and he was like, oh, if you say so, right? Like, so it's mentioning that he kind of, took advantage of this woman to the point of where he broke her, and now she's a prostitute. And Linehan even kind of blames him for that, right? So yeah, then they come across that harp in the road. I talked about that. The harp looks tired. The narrator is tired. They don't stay there for long. He sees the maid. And Linehan is the one that gets excited, and he suggests that the two of them just sort of like ogle at her from a distance. And he's like, what does she look like? But Corley thinks that's creepy a little bit. He accuses Linehan of trying to maybe take his woman, and he says something like, "I'm not going to eat her," right? Whereas there she is, and he's like, I don't want an introduction. All I want is to look at her. I'm not going to eat her, right? Like midway through page 55. "Damn it," said Linehan boldly, "I don't want an introduction. All I want is to have a look at her. I'm not going to eat her," right? So, agreeing to meet up with Curly later, Linehan goes, so that's sort of, Corley says, "Look, I'll go over there and meet her, right? And then you can sort of follow along, and I'll let you do like a walk by. You go up the other side of the street, and you just walk by so you can get a glimpse at her, and then we'll meet later," right? And they agree, and so then, but when Curly's gone, so we get the description of the maid there in her Sunday clothes. You might read something into the blue of her dress being like the color of Ireland. I didn't particularly read too much into that. And then we get to she had buck teeth. She's not very attractive. She's short, stocky, strong, teeth that stick out. Like, it doesn't, I didn't find that very compelling, attractive imagery, right? Now, then Corley leaves with her, right? And he follows them all the way to the tram station, right? And watches them get on the tram, So he's really like stalking them. And after they're gone, Linehan's demeanor really changes. And he takes on this tired and thoughtful persona. And he wanders around the streets for a while, and he sees this quote-unquote refreshment bar. To be honest with you, I'm not sure what that is, like a cafe or what, it had food and drink. A pub, maybe, but they didn't call it a pub, they called it a refreshment bar. I don't know the distinction between pubs and refreshment bars in Ireland. But he orders some food, but it's interesting that he orders green peas and also sort of an Irish color. But it's interesting that he can't afford, he was initially drawn in by the meat and the ale, but he has to ask how much the peas even cost. And he eats some peas and drinks an ale, and he's like, "These are the best peas I've ever had." The guy's really hungry. It says he greedily ate them, right? And before he got there was a point I wanted to mention. Sorry, on page 57, I passed by it. It says, "He felt trivial, all that was meant to charm him, and did not answer the glances. His face looked older, his gaiety seemed to forsake him." Those last two paragraphs on page 57 sort of describe how his demeanor changed. He didn't find it interesting with the absence of Curly to follow women on his own, right? Like, you'd think most guys would be like, "Oh, my friend is now off with his woman. Now I'm going to go find a girl now, or maybe go play some video games or do something." You know what I mean? He was just lost. He didn't know what to do with himself. Couldn't even be bothered to talk to a girl. It's like, it's not worth it. He didn't have the boldness. It invited him to be bold. He knew he'd have to speak a great deal, to invent and amuse, and his brain and throat were too dry for such a task. He just couldn't be bothered. He didn't have the energy. So he goes to this refreshment bar, orders a meager meal of peas, ginger beer, and starts to imagine Corley's exploits with his lover, right? And he's got this codependent relationship with Corley, where he can't live his life. He said the problem now is, how could he pass the hours until he meets Corley again? And that troubled him. He could think of no way of passing the time. So he's living vicariously through Corley's life. And as I mentioned before, one of the major themes in all of Dubliners, in every one of these small stories, is escape. And Linehan seems to have found a version of escape for himself in Curly, living his life vicariously through Corley's adventures and misadventures, to the point where they distract him from his own life and he doesn't have to be aware of his own problems or come up with solutions to his own problems. He just focuses on Corley. He does mildly muse over the dissatisfaction about his own life, and it mentions, at 31 years old, on page 59, it's revealed that he's 31, and it says, would he ever get a job? Would he ever have a home of his own? He thought how pleasant it would be to have a warm fire to sit by and a dinner to go to, and blah, blah, blah. But then if you look at the last sentence in that, you have to bear in mind, he's still very financially and obviously personally insecure. He wants to settle down, but he doesn't have any idea how to do this. And the thing that comes to his mind is he could probably settle down and live happily ever after if he could come across some simple-minded girl with a little of the ready. So, if he could, basically looking for a mommy to take care of him, like some dim-witted woman who's willing to pay for his way. Like he could settle down if he could find that. And he finishes his meal with that. He pays this 2 pence to the slatternly girl. It says he goes out of the shop and he wanders around because he doesn't know what else to do with himself. He encounters some friends, and there's not a lot. That's just like a segue on the top of page 60. I didn't find much in that that was just almost like an anecdote in the story, right? Just something to kill the time, because I think Joyce needed to have the character do something while he was walking around. It's sort of demonstrate that a certain amount of time had passed, right? So yeah, he encounters these friends and they briefly talk. Nothing important. And then he's on his way again. And he's right away back to thinking about Corley, right? His mind became active again. He wonders how Corley managed successfully. Back to this theme of vicarious life and escape, escaping his life through the vicarious life of his friend. He suffered all the pangs and thrills of his friend's situation, right? Now, he gets desperate in this. If you look at the bottom of page 60, that paragraph, and the beginning of page 61 shows how he starts to get desperate that maybe Corley ditched him. Maybe he told him to meet him at Merchant Street, but him and the girl are going off on their own way. So, he's thinking maybe Corley chose the girl over him and they're going to sneak off somewhere and enjoy the rest of their night rather than let sort of Linehan sort of spy on the end of their. It's a weird thing that Corley's allowed him to do here, to sort of witness him, be his bear witness to his date, right? And let's see. There's an interesting thing about Linehan. I'll get to that in a moment. We're almost finished with the story. So just at that moment when, Linehan is smoking his last cigarette that he saved, and you just see how desperate this guy is. He can't even eat lunch. He ate a meager meal and he had one cigarette that he'd been saving. And it's creepy. He saved it for this final moment. It's almost he's getting off on this, seeing them together, and he smokes this last cigarette, that he has. And he can't even smoke the cigarette properly because it breaks, in his hand, and he throws it into the street. And he watches Curly and his lover, go near this house. Presumably it's the house where the woman works, who she's a, quote, slave for, or maid. And Corley waits a minute. He brings her, she goes in the house, and he's standing out there waiting, and Linehan's a bit confused about what happens, and then she hurries back out and she puts something in Curly's hand, and Linehan can't see what it is, and then she runs back in the house. And so then at that point, Linehan calls Curly over to see what's happened, and just silently, Curly opens his hand to reveal this gold coin. So now at the very end of the story, we know what it is. The it isn't, is he going to be successful in sleeping with this girl, but is he going to be able to convince her to rob her employer for him, which they did. And we don't know how big or valuable the gold coin is, but gold is valued. A gold coin, by today's standards, would be worth, over $1,000. You know what I mean? a gold coin about this size, like this, that's the size of a $50 US, $2,500. So the interesting thing about gold is it might not be worth the dollar amount, but a piece of gold will buy the same goods a long time ago as it would now. You know what I mean? Like however much gold it costs to buy a house now, that you could buy that same house with that same amount of gold more or less a long, long time ago. It's just that the dollar amount of the value of the gold has changed, fluctuates, right? But gold holds its weight very strongly in that way. So, all right, so that's sort of the summary of it. And there's something, if I can go into like religion a little bit, that's one of the themes here. It's a bit of a tangent, but I think it's interesting. We know that that Linehan's 31, right? And we know that Britain is Catholic. The Catholics were Roman. The Romans conquered, and the Irish got the short end of that stick all the way around, right? Even though ironically it's the Irish Catholics who want to remain pro-Irish, and it's the Protestants who want to be joining England. That's an interesting twist, but nevertheless, the thing I want to point out is, if I'm not mistaken, right, the story in the Bible about Jesus, he died in his 30s, but he was baptized when he was in his 30s as well. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was when he was 31 years old. Now, we know in the story that it was raining, right? Because if you look at page 61 and 62, look at the very bottom of page 61. It says, Linehan hurried on in the same direction. And then some drops of rain, of light rain, fell. And it says, he took them as a warning. Now, at first you might just think on the surface, a warning of getting wet. But I think this is a deeper warning that he's thinking of here, almost like a sign from God. Because if we go back to the beginning, and if we look at some of this in a religious context, look at page 49. Second paragraph, it says, 2 young men came down the hill of Rutland Square. One of them was bringing blah, 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 and the other walked on the verge of the path. Now, the verge of the path means the side of the path. He wasn't quite on the path. He was near the path, but he strayed from the path. Now, if I look at that in a religious context, I think he's straying from the righteous path, right? Which clearly they are, right? They're taking advantage of women. I think that could be interpreted that way. And then what further solidifies that interpretation of him participating in his own demise, if you will, like much of these characters do. They're participating in their own oppression and whatnot. He wants to prevent himself from being baptized, if you will, right? If he represents, this person who needs to be saved through baptism. Look at his clothes on page 49. Everything's waterproof. He's wearing a yachting cap, so a boat cap, which would prevent his head from getting wet. Where is it? Once or twice he rearranged his light waterproof, which slung over one shoulder, and rubber shoes, and his jauntily slung waterproof expressed youth. What does that even mean if we're not talking about this religious contract? Like, he's wearing all waterproof clothes as if he's going yachting, but we know this is a poor guy. Like, he's not going yachting. Like, why is he wearing all these yacht clothes? Like, it seems out of place, right? And then it mentions his waterproof youth, waterproof expressed youth. So he's not, the guy's 31 years old. He's not a youth. He's not an adolescent. It might be worth, if you're looking for something from a religious context, you could look at that, right? Now, let me see, how much time do we have? Do I have time to go over a deeper analysis of this? We do. All right, so let's backtrack a little bit. So the way that Corley kind of carelessly forces Linehan into the street as they walk in the beginning indicates his selfish, narcissistic, thoughtless personality. He only cares about impressing Linehan with his story, but he doesn't care about his friend's well-being. And Linehan seems completely immune to Corley's thoughtlessness, though indicates that he doesn't expect any better from his friend, or that he doesn't think he even deserves any better, maybe, right? And as Linehan's kind of ravaged description indicates, life has beaten him down to the point where he's just sort of stuck in limbo. You know, he's 31 years old, but he's living his life as if he's like a college kid, you know? He manages to maintain this facade of happiness, but only when he's either around Corley or he's thinking about Corley. The way he continuously looks at Corley's face to see like if he's reacting the right way, you know, to what he's saying. He's like, it's almost like he's constantly putting on a performance, and Corley is his audience, right? And this performance tires him out. You know, maintaining this like false persona has got to be exhausting, right? So he must act strategically in order to be included in different social situations. And even then, he's seen as a social leech. It says, you know, quote, most people consider Linehan a social leech, end quote. Because it's obvious that he's partially motivated by wanting people to do things like buy him drinks, you know? And in this way, it seems that Linehan's relationships are all super shallow. They're all transactional, right? Not rooted in genuine connection. So he lacks belonging. He's discontent. He's restless. The two men do not discuss women with respect at all. Instead, crude phrases like "she's a fine tart" or "they pick somebody up." They treat them, you know, the maid in particular, just as a sex object that Corley's using, and like Linehan, essentially manipulates people to include him in social situations. Like I said, to buy drinks. Corley exploits women, and in this case, this maid, to buy him things. We mentioned already those things. See, it seems that his desire for money has replaced any genuine human interaction based on love. And Linehan knows that Corley doesn't mean to marry the girl, like no chance, right? His fear of the maid getting pregnant implies that he has no interest in being a husband or a father. He's only using the maid for his selfish ends, yes? Now, though the story is titled Two Gallants, this incident illustrates that Corley is far from gallant, right? And Linehan does nothing to stop Corley's habits. He encourages it, right? And though Corley comes from a family with no money and some level of status, he's portrayed as lazy, downtrodden. He could find an honest job, and it even says, you know, he's the type of guy that like all of his friends are always offering him work when work's available. But for whatever reason, he doesn't take it. It describes his sweatiness as being large, globular, and oily. So, you know, he's got a large, globular, oily head, implying that, you know, he's greasy or slippery, kind of literally and figuratively. He's dishonest. He flatters people. He says what people want to hear in order to get what he wants from them, right? And this applies to his job as a police informant, which likely involves integrate himself into people only to later betray them. He's a narc. Now, while Corley is absorbed in these womanizing activities, Linehan's attention at first is on the moon, and we might analyze that as a symbol, or I mean, it's kind of in passing, but it's something that transcends earthly concerns, and it almost has a religious context of its own. How it mentions the moon's quote double halo, an angel or Christ has a halo, right? And because this has a double halo, it gives it this maybe angelic or Christ-like appearance, associating it with divinity and purity and something that's out of his reach. And, you may interpret this as the moon symbolizing Linehan's longing for something more meaningful than just sex and money, and maybe even manipulating women for those things. And this maybe begins to suggest the way that Linehan and Curly are. They're aimless, restless, childish, and mostly manipulative, and is perhaps a product of their society rather than what they maybe genuinely want. And that he realizes that this is an unnatural and ultimately unfulfilling way to live. But the moon's distance, suggests that maybe a more meaningful life or any kind of solution to that, to find fulfillment, is out of reach in Dublin. And let's see, Linny's questions. Linehan's questions sets up an expectation that Corley is trying to have sex with the maid, pull it off. I thought, meant that he's convincing her to sleep with him, and then we get that word Lothario. Linehan jokingly calls Corley a Lothario, which is basically a womanizer, a player, somebody who seduces women to get something out of them, not love or relationships, either sex or goods. And it's interesting, like Curly seems to have taken this as a compliment, right? As something to indicate maybe his sexual prowess, right? Even though it's not really meant to be a compliment, but he seems to have taken it that way. But Linehan seems to have seen the situation's unpleasantness, and he calls him a gay Lothario, which sort of is a bit weird. You have to wonder, does Linehan have a secret love attraction to Corley? He's certainly obsessed with him, right? He mocks him a little bit, and this whole thing is just a cheap scenario. I don't know any other word to say it. It's cheap and superficial, right? They mentioned in passing a woman that they saw in a car, and Corley maybe is a little bit saddened that the woman that he once dated now apparently is a prostitute, or I think so. It alludes to the fact that she's in a car with some guys, right? A party girl at the very least, if not a prostitute, right? But he's seemingly unaware of the fact that he and Linehan have these impossible standards for women. But part of him seems to want a woman who's entirely pure and chaste, right? By the way, they shame the women, for having had other men before them, you know what I mean? And also, by the way, they gaze at the moon, which symbolizes purity. Yet they also become cynical about courtship and romance and expect women to have sex with them. So it's a double standard that they have. Linehan even suggests that Curly driving a woman into prostitution is something to be proud of. Now, notably in the 1900s when the story was set, so early 20th century, Ireland, as we've discussed, but it's important to just keep reiterating this fact, is that Ireland was a colonial state under English rule. So the way that Corley and Linehan conquer, objectify, and exploit women mirrors the way that England was treating Ireland at this time, right? And that comes through in the harp and everything, right? With its pants down, with the image of the woman around, skirt down around her knees. Now, they're walking past Trinity College, which is ironic because that's a Catholic school, and they're talking about taking advantage of women and having sex with women, right? At this holy, it's not a holy ground, but kind of, you know what I mean? Most people would be like reading Bibles, or they're hanging out there at night, like talking about taking advantage of women, right? There's a bit of irony in that. So Corley's up to very ungallant ways, right? A gentleman wouldn't take a lady, wouldn't make a lady even wait a bit, as he said, made her wait a bit. But, we know Corley's no gentleman. He's not gallant. Linehan does nothing to try to change Corley, though instead he goes along with Corley's idea and laughs about it. They objectify the maid, refer to her as a fine, decent tart. They're only concerned with Corley's ability to bring whatever it is, the job off. And again, presumably that's to have sex with her. But again, this points to the decline in relationships between men and women that symbolizes the decline in relationships between England and Ireland at that time. Moreover, Corley and Linehan seem content to continue walking aimlessly around Dublin, which is, I guess, an activity that kind of symbolizes their general restlessness and lack of purpose in life. So that just walking around Dublin in itself is a symbol, if you will, for their lack of purpose. I've already mentioned the harp, how it's significant that it was played heedlessly. Represents Ireland's plight at that time. Can I say anything else about that? I guess this kind of represents Ireland's plight at the time. The story implies that Ireland is being carelessly played by the colonizers. And also by men like Linehan and Corley who do nothing to better themselves or better their country. So it's just another example of these people eagerly participating in their own oppression, right? And thus this mournful music that's being played, and I don't know, this silent O Moil, we could look at that and see the significance of that song. Sorry, I didn't research that one. But we do know that it's a mournful song, and so we could say that symbolizes maybe the mournful state of Ireland itself, or at least, particularly Dublin itself. Now, we get to this Sunday afternoon with this long description of the maid, and she's wearing blue, white blouse. It's a Sunday, and if you think of the colors of blue and white, if you go to a Catholic church, have you ever been in a Catholic church? Have you seen the statue of the Virgin Mary? I don't think I've ever seen her not with blue and white, right? So these are, in a way, like colors that are associated with the Virgin Mary in Catholicism, at least, which was the dominant religion in Ireland at that time. But the irony, again, is her meeting with Corley is far from a religious encounter. The two have already been sleeping together. This meeting is not really for a romantic purpose, but it's for Corley to get something from her. And there's religious symbolism in all of this. The thing that he wants to get from her is a gold coin. And, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but since we're on the topic of religion, if you think about the story of Christ being one who suffered and one who was oppressed, right? And you think about Ireland being oppressed, and this maid in particular being oppressed, Corley taking advantage of her, and then she pays him off with a gold coin. It's not perfect, but there's a lot of comparisons that we can draw to the story of Christ about how Judas betrayed Christ for, what was it, 30, I think it was silver coins or whatever, but the coins nevertheless, right? So it doesn't perfectly line up, but I think it might be hinting at that. You could definitely read that into it. Again, I don't know if that's Joyce's intention here, but he doesn't do anything half-heartedly, Joyce. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure that this symbolism was intentional in some way. And that's sort of what I can think. Because it could have been anything. You know, she could have been wearing like purple or green or any other color. And it could have been, you know, anything. It could have been a watch or anything. Why a coin, you know? And why mention this path? And why the Linehan not wanting to get wet and wearing rubber clothes, and even his age is like waterproof. He can't grow up, you know. He can't be forgiven, you know. There's no way for him to repent and you know, be saved through any method like baptism would save you from being a sinner in the Christian church, you know. It's a bit messy, the metaphors here, but I see that as like an extended metaphor throughout the story, right? And, you know, this moment is again, the story's full of irony right away from the title ongoing. This moment is ironic because she's in her Sunday finery, which is, you know, kind of ostentatious and cheap because she's a maid. She can't afford, you know, something. It's not the sort of outfit that probably people would actually wear to church. It says she's wearing a ragged boa. The flower pin was upside down. I mean, it says she's attractive, but I didn't find her, you know, short, stocky, strong. I don't know, buck teeth. I didn't find that a very attractive sounding image. But said she was healthy, in good health or whatever, so she's not a sickly woman at least. Yeah, the irony of her being dressed with the colors Virgin Mary and she's no saintly figure, you know, and I don't know, something to ponder. Anything else? We can talk about paralyzing, right? We haven't talked about that theme yet. Paralyzation. That's something that sort of flows through most of these stories. So I think at the point in the story where Linehan is left alone, right? When Corley's gone with the woman, Linehan is very eager to live vicariously through this life. The only times he feels lively again is when he goes back to thinking about Corley, right? You know, before that he seems older. His gaiety had dissipated. And this would have been the gaiety, not homosexuality, but the old meaning of gaiety, like happiness and joy in his life, right? Is dissipated, right? So he isn't satisfied anymore with the same shallow pursuits that Corley enjoys. He starts to have a little bit of a realization there, but kind of in the same way that in Evelyn, she had a bit of a revelation, but then had a panic attack and was paralyzed. We see that sort of same scenario here. Like Linehan seems to long for more meaningful relationships and a sense of purpose, but he's paralyzed when it comes to actually doing anything about it, right? And Ireland as a whole was similarly paralyzed at this time, and it stagnated, and it was unable to forge a path forward, maybe, for itself, while under the colonial rule of the Brits of England. And I guess the futility and stagnation that Linehan is left with, and you know, I guess that all of Ireland was experiencing as well at that time, are symbolized by his urge to just keep walking, you know, not to anywhere, not for anything, but just to walk, you know, and this sort of I guess Joyce was pointing to the Irish people to say, you know, don't be so superficial. Like, make what you're doing mean something. You know, not just walk around like la 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 with your fingers in your ears, pretending that everything's okay, and think about something else. You know, I think that's what he's getting at there. Anything else? I mean, we talked about Lennon's vicariousness. He's always like looking on, but he's never really participating actively. And that sort of reflects this inner sense of like unbelonging to him. He's always on the outskirts of everything. He's an onlooker even in his own life. I think that's it. I think that's all I've got. So I'm going to pause this video. I'll post this for you. You can use this for your revisions. Hopefully this is useful. And I'll just mention here, wherever I post this, leave any comments, questions. We can build a dialogue wherever this video ends up. Thanks for watching.